So if you don't already know, we're coming up to that time of year again, which means it's time to get ready in the spooky mindset, spooky mentality. It's Halloween, guys. So basically, I thought in this video I would go through my raw materials collection and look for some raw materials that I thought reminded me of Halloween. So I've picked out 5 raw materials which I'm going to talk about with you guys, so that if you're interested in doing some kind of Halloween project, or you're looking for some ideas for various raw materials to go inside of your Halloween themed perfumes, then here are a couple of quite unusual ideas that you might like to try. So we're going to get straight into it, and I'm going to start with one called Verdox. Now, Verdox is a top note. And what it smells like is a nice kind of sweet appley smell. Now, some people when they smell Verdox are not particularly impressed straight away, and that's because the smell is not super powerful, like some of the esters, for example, like manzanite, which is also an appley smell. But Verdox is a lot more subtle and soft and rounded. But this can actually be very useful, because when you're trying to create a perfume, often you have a lot of these loud notes going on, which can really stick out. And when you're trying to go and blend them all together and soften them down, something like Verdox in the top note to create this kind of sweet, appley, let's say, kind of backdrop, or almost a glue that binds everything else together. This can be very useful. It can be used in a slightly similar way in that sense to Hedione, in the sense that you can put a lot of this big kind of voluminous raw material, and it can help to soften out the edges of the actual more prominent things, which, while you may want those to make the character of your perfume, sometimes it can be nicer for them to be framed a little bit nicely. Now, of course, Verdox can be used to create an apple note in and of its own right, and it can also be used in an apple accord with various other things, for example, fructone or esters. It's also got a little bit of an earthy note, which is something that's shared with the Damascones, which also have appley and earthy facets to them, in my opinion. But I quite like this because it just reminds me of that late fall or autumn kind of apples falling on the ground, around Halloween time. You've got the smell of the decaying apples and the earth in the soil, kind of almost like, reminds me of like an apple tree in a graveyard, that kind of smell. So I always think things like Damascones and some of those things are very Halloweeny, but I think Verdox is one great one that you can use. Now, another thing that makes it Halloweeny is if you want to go for that kind of toffee apple or caramel apple accord, you can then go and take some caramel notes. For example, those I talked about in the video I did on caramel notes for Perfumery, and then you could go mix them with Verdox and some other appley things to actually create a toffee apple accord. So that's number 1. And by the way, if you're in the UK, we now stock Verdox over at the Fragrance Foundry. Right, so number 2 here is an unusual one called Trans 2 Octanal. And this one I actually picked up from Harrison Joseph, the raw materials store. Haven't seen it anywhere else. But this one is, well, what does it smell like? It basically smells like the actual kind of flesh smell of a pumpkin. And that's quite cool, because often when people in perfumery or flavors think of the smell or flavor of pumpkin, they think of something like pumpkin spice. But pumpkin spice, which I also did a video on a while back, so if you are interested in that, go and watch it. But pumpkin spice is actually nothing to do with pumpkins at all. It's just a mixture of spices that's often put in things like coffee, and then marketed with a picture of a pumpkin and called pumpkin spice. But it's not actually related. Whereas this stuff, Trans 2 Octanal, does actually smell like the flesh of the inside of a gourd or a pumpkin. It's that kind of fresh, watery smell. So actually, it makes me think if you're going to use this in a perfume, you'd generally find it easier to use in large amounts if you like the smell in more of a kind of, let's say, a watery or a fresh style perfume. But of course, you can always use it as a freshener in other things. And this, both in smell and structure, is actually very similar to cucumber aldehyde, which smells of cucumbers. So again, very similar smell. And that's also naturally found in violet leaf. So if you've ever smelled that kind of that green, fresh violet leaf smell, if you smell violet leaf absolute, it smells a bit like that as well. So if you're going for this kind of halfway between, I would say, watery and green smell, then something like this can be nice. So I'd imagine if you're making a perfume or an accord which is kind of like, I would say more of an outdoorsy Halloween thing, like, you know, going to a pumpkin patch on a fresh morning, then this could be quite useful for that kind of thing. Right, so next we have something called Gelsone. So this one is now getting onto more of a mid note, and the reason that I picked this is because to me, this kind of smells like sweets, a little bit like, you know, like Tutti Frutti sweets or some kind of like Haribo sweets or something like that. So it makes me think of kind of trick-or-treating. It's just that kind of, it's that kind of a generic kind of sweet smell without being in one particular direction. Like some of the esters, like isoamyl-acetate, for example, smells very much of foam bananas, and hexyl-acetate smells very much of kind of pear drops, that kind of thing. But this stuff, this Gelsone, it just gives me this kind of general kind of sweet smell. And if you go and actually smell into it, it smells a little bit almost like cognac, very, very slightly. And it also smells in general a bit like how acetates smell. So if you've smelled various acetate aroma chemicals, you should recognize this common kind of sweet, slightly synthetic smell that they have and share between them. And this has that to it as well. Now, how this one is actually usually classified and used by perfumers is it's actually usually used in relation to jasmine, and that's because this is very similar in smell to something called hexyl cinnamaldehyde and amyl cinnamaldehyde. And these are two aroma chemicals classically used in jasmine accord recreations, especially before they had some of the more modern things we use in jasmine accords today. Now, I wouldn't say, to my nose, that it has some kind of realistic jasmine smell to it, but it does smell like those other aroma chemicals, and this, along with those, do work in jasmine accords. It's just a slightly more of a synthetic-y jasmine accord than a very realistic one. But, you know, it might be interesting. That's where these things usually come from. But I just thought it smelled like sweets. All right, so the next one I've got here is Undecavertol. Now, a little bit like we had the Trans 2-octanol, which had a green facet, Undecavertol is very much a green note, and this one is extremely powerful. And I would say it's a mid note, so it lasts kind of a reasonable amount of time. So this one, to me, I've always described it as this kind of piercing green smell, but it's got a sweetness to it as well. And the reason that this reminds me of Halloween is because it makes me think of like a slime smell. And I don't necessarily think that's a real thing because I don't actually remember smelling a real slime. But I think when I was a kid, I probably had some kind of like kids like concoctions kit or something weird like that, which had a slime in and it smelled like this. It probably was just using this. But ever since I smelled this, in my head now, I associate it with the smell of like bubbling concoctions and slime for some reason. So it makes me think, you know, that it's kind of a green smell as well. And like, you know, you think of like in Halloween and stuff, slime to be like a glowing green thing. So I think it does fit the bill quite well. If you want to make this into more of like a slime accord, I actually think mixing it with Calone, Undecavertol and Calone both go together to achieve that kind of thing. So if you want to make a Halloween slime smell, then try some of those. Okay, and then finally, I've got here Orchid salicylate, which is a more unusual salicylate. And if you know the smell of amyl salicylate, which is very popular and common, that is something that, you know, it's kind of got this, it's quite an abstract smell, but I would put it tenuously close to things like a slight violety facet and a slight soapy facet, and it's quite fresh and clean. Now, and that's used a lot in classic kind of men's barbershop or kind of fougere style perfumes. But this stuff, this Orchid salicylate, structurally, it's not too different. And in terms of smell, it's similar, but not the same. But the difference between this and the amyl salicylate is I find this more neutral, and it's a lot more what I feel is like kind of white and powdery. And therefore, I feel like this is really good for anything that's kind of white and ethereal. So you could use this in like a powdery sense, like snow at Christmas or something. But I was thinking in the context of Halloween, this would actually really encapsulate nicely the kind of the smell of like a white kind of ghost, like a very ethereal kind of ghost. That it's like that kind of slightly delicate, powdery kind of smell you can imagine of this ethereal presence being there. I feel like this Orchid salicylate does a good job of capturing that kind of thing. So if you want a smell of a ghost in the perfume, then, you know, maybe it's a bit of a hot take, but I feel like this Orchid salicylate could be creatively used to achieve that. So there you have it. That's my 5 mostly unusual aroma chemicals for Halloween. Hopefully this gives you some inspiration, and even if not, I hope you enjoy your next Halloween whenever you are watching this video, whenever it may be. So until then, I'll see you next time.